Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 4, Life and Death from Questions and Answers. Fundamentals of the Occult Sciences by Manly P. Hall. Life and Death, Part 4. What is the doctrine of reincarnation and karma? Reincarnation and karma are the principal doctrines of Buddhism that were also taught by several other systems of esoteric philosophy, especially the Pythagorean and Platonic schools. The doctrine of reincarnation teaches that man lives on this earth not once but many times, returning until he has perfected himself in every lesson that this world has to teach. The doctrine of karma teaches that everything which happens in nature is dominated by the law of cause and effect. The law of cause and effect applied to man shows that everything that happens to an individual is an aspect of universal justice. Every man is in the place he has earned for himself. Every man is doing the thing he has earned the right to do. No one is suffering for the mistakes of others, but for his own mistakes. The only way to be happy, therefore, is to live well, thus setting in action constructive cycles of cause and effect. If we want to be happy, we must cause happiness. If we want to be wise, we must earn wisdom. Every individual who lives in the world is in the place he has earned for himself by his actions in this or previous lives. The average number of Earth lives through which the human soul will pass in this cycle of evolution is approximately 800. By the time man has lived in this world 800 times, he will know how to live well. Reincarnation makes accomplishment possible to all and makes each man the captain of his own soul. The doctrines of vicarious atonement and infant damnation are disposed of forever. Man lives in an honest world in which he can only succeed by being honest himself. The doctrine of reincarnation and karma is the only teaching concerning the reasons for and the ultimate of life, which is worthy of a philosopher. What is death? Metaphysically interpreted, death is the separation of the higher and lower principles in man. The living human being is a compound creature consisting of superphysical principles manifesting through a physical body composed of the elements of so-called physical nature. The superphysical principles constitute the real living person, and the body is merely a vehicle by means of which the superphysical man can manifest in this physical world. The spiritual self dwells in the body like a man living in a house, but the average person never learns that the house is not the man, nor that there is any difference between the two. Plato says that man lives in his body like the oyster lives in his shell, and the Hindu philosophers refer to the body as the garment or vestment of the superphysical self. By means of the nerve centers and the ductless gland system, the spiritual man controls and directs the physical body, giving it the appearance of life. Thus it is not really the body that is living, but the spiritual man in the body which animates it. The light of the inner self shines out through the body like the flame shining through the glass of a lantern. There is just as much difference between the qualities of the inner man and his outer body as there is between the flame in the lamp and the glass and metal that form the lantern. In the symbolism of the Greek philosophers, it was said that the body is the temporary house of the inner self. The real spiritual man is like a traveler wandering across the desert of living. This inner self stays for a while in one house and then departs from the house and journeys on to another one. Each time the ego builds a house, it builds a better one, or, as the Persian poets wrote, weaves ever more beautiful garments for itself out of the wealth, beauty, and understanding of the inward soul. After the entity has dwelt in a body for a certain number of years, the body, which is ruled by the laws of the physical world, grows old and decrepit and unworthy of the life within it. When the life can no longer function because of disease, accident, or the natural infirmities of age, the ego departs from that body, producing by its departure the phenomenon of death. Death is not the dying of the self or the ceasing of the spirit or even the ceasing of the purpose of the spirit, but is rather life, with mind, soul, and understanding, departing out of a worn-out garment or a house no longer fit for its inhabitants. Plato says that the spirit rises from the sepulchre of the body. The Bhagavad Gita, the beautiful mystical book of the Brahmans, says that the spirit casts off its worn-out garments and prepares itself a more glorious vestment. The corpse is really the natural condition of the body, and in death we perceive the earthy elements returned to the inanimate state. The body is therefore like an empty glove from which the hand has been withdrawn. But because we see the empty glove, we have no proof that the hand is also dead. Because we see the empty shells by the side of the sea, we are apt to think all life ends at the grave, but life never dies. Bodies cease, but life is eternal, but life never dies. Bodies cease, but life is eternal. Death is the spirit casting off the bonds of flesh to function for a time in the invisible world before building another vehicle of physical manifestation. Thus, while death seems to the uninformed to be a great tragedy, it is understood by the philosopher as a magnificent spiritual experience, life's supreme adventure, the return of the spirit to its own state, and a release of inner greatness from bondage to the limitations of inadequate flesh. Describe the after-death state. During the years of life in the physical world, man gathers a vast amount of experience. During life, this experience is not digested nor arranged in any systematic pattern. The period between incarnations is the period of assimilation, during which the entity builds the experiences of life into the soul nature to become internal strength. The entity does not make any new development or growth between lives, for its subjective existence does not extend into the sphere of phenomena. The after-death state is variously symbolized in the different religious systems of the world. Divested of symbolical figures, the state of life between incarnations may be summed up as follows. After leaving the physical body, the entity functions temporarily in the etheric double or body of the fifth element. This body resembles closely the appearance of the physical form, but is composed of subtle, superphysical essences. The entity remains in this body only a few days unless it is earthbound or is in the former case, it will remain until its tie with the world is broken, and in the latter it will remain until the time its normal death would have occurred. The consciousness in the etheric body is almost identical with physical consciousness, and those who have passed on are frequently not even aware that they have died. The etheric double is really a part of the physical body, and after the entity has passed on to the inner planes of nature, the etheric body slowly disintegrates, retaining for some time its form and constituting that which is sometimes called the ghost. These etheric forms are the ghosts which sensitive people often see about graveyards. After a brief period in the etheric double, the entity passes on to the astral world, the sphere of desires and emotions, and functions in the astral body, leaving the etheric shell to disintegrate in the etheric world. The astral world is called the sphere of punishments and rewards. In this plane, the entity experiences as fact the emotional reflexes of its physical living. The ancients say that the principal thing about this experiencing is that by some mysterious law of nature, the entity becomes the victim of all the evils which it has committed. This period of correction is called by the Roman Church purgatory, or the place of purgings from sin. It is the sphere where man puts his emotional life in order and builds the nucleus for a future emotional nature. Having worn out the records in the sin body, the entity passes on to the highest sphere of the emotional world, where its constructive emotions build positive aesthetic values into the permanent consciousness. Having lived through constructive emotions and gained from them their full merit, the entity then moves out of the astral body and functions in its mental nature. The mental body is the sphere of thought. It is likewise divided into destructive and constructive planes. After the lower mind has been expiated and its records built into consciousness, the entity functions in the higher or constructive mind, where the rewards of right mental action become the nucleus of greater mental integrity in the next life. Having completed its mental function in the sphere and substance of mind, the entity passes out of the mental nature and retires into its own essences, where it remains without function and without awareness for a certain time before it begins the building of a new chain of bodies for its next life. The cycle of after-death experience differs with different grades of evolution. Primitive peoples, having but little individuality, have but little after-death experience and reincarnate almost immediately. Average entities of the fifth root race are out of incarnation from 800 to 1200 years. The length of time in the planes of the astral and mental spheres depends upon the intensity of the feeling and thinking and the scope of the records which have been accumulated during Earth life. Very highly advanced souls are out of incarnation for many thousands of years, and because of the depth of their thinking, have extended periods of consciousness in the mental plane. The children who die before reaching adolescence usually reincarnate almost immediately, as do also animals, because there are no important records to be built into the egoic consciousness. There is no absolutely set interval between incarnations, but usually the intervals are reasonably regular and there is an alternation of sex. This is the philosophical doctrine which disposes of heaven and hell by teaching that these terms signify the after-death cycles of reward and punishment. There is no eternal damnation in philosophy and no static heaven. There is infinite growth through cycles of experience which men call life and death. Explain the process of rebirth. Rebirth is the descent of the superphysical man into the elements of the material world. The ancients signified this process under the symbolism of souls ascending and descending the rungs of a great ladder which extended from heaven to earth. The Eleusinian mysteries, which were celebrated for more than 1,000 years in Attica, consisted of 9 symbolical pageantries to represent the 9 conditions passed through by the soul as it departed from its celestial home to take up dwelling in the mortal frame. The rebirth cycle was represented among the Chaldeans by the myth of Ishtar. This goddess descended through 7 gates, leaving with the keepers of the gates the 7 emblems of her royalty. At last, bereft of all her grandeur, she entered the house of Sin, the moon god, or, as the Greeks expressed it, entered the sublunary sphere. In the kingdom of Sin, Ishtar was tortured and humiliated. All manner of evil was heaped upon her. By this was represented the state of the soul in the physical world. Ishtar was eventually rescued from the god of darkness, and ascending the ladder of the spheres received back from the custodians the emblems of her divinity. By this is to be understood the restoration of the soul to its state of glory through the disciplines of philosophy. According to Plato, the human soul is drawn back into the world by the worldliness within itself. That is, the soul, having accepted the reality of material things, is moved by its own conviction back into the sphere of its belief. As worldliness dies within the consciousness, the gravitational pull of matter lessens until at last, released from all the illusions of the material state, the soul ascends from body to union with the blessed gods. The law which pulls the spiritual entity back to physical life is karma. All causes which have been set up in the physical world must be finished or worked out by physical experience. Man, bound to the generating plane by sense, emotion, feeling, desire, and appetite, must conquer these impulses and instincts before the cycle of physical rebirth can end. As Buddha taught, the nirvana, or liberation, is accomplished only by the dying out of the fires of emotion and sense in the self. The Greeks represented the soul as naturally yearning upward to the light of truth, but constantly drawn downward against its will by the imperfection of its lower extremities. The Sphinx with the human head and the body of the animal is thus a symbol of the soul. Persephone, whose life is divided between a celestial and infernal abode, is also a figure of this fact. The parable of the prodigal son who leaves his father's house for the flesh pots of Egypt to return in the end repentant is the biblical equivalent to the allegories of the Greeks. Having incorporated into its consciousness the experiences of the previous incarnation, the soul is a compound of experience and karma. Some things have been mastered. Much more remains to be accomplished, and the soul is drawn irresistibly back to the sphere of its unfinished labors. Descending from its own supersubstantial essence, the soul builds around itself an intellectual nature or mental body. Then the soul, robed in its mental vestments and partly obscured by the limitations of thought, descends into the sphere of feeling, where it takes upon itself a body of desire which further limits its effulgence. Robed in its thoughts and desires, the soul then descends into the sea of the humidic ethers, which the Greeks describe as the link between the visible and invisible worlds. This humidic ether is the sea of life over which rules Poseidon or Neptune, whose trident is the pitchfork of Satan, by which the prince of evil is said to herd souls in the lower world. The ethers are called also the waters of forgetfulness, the ever-flowing spring of Lethe. Immersed in the ethers, the soul forgets its divine estate, and its eyes are closed to the glory of its own source. It is from the ethers that the soul descends into physical form. In the Greek fables, souls waiting to enter physical generation are described as flocks of sheep, and Hermes is their lord. He is called the psychopomp, or the herder of souls. Here, this god represents cosmic law, especially in the aspects of reincarnation and karma, the force that brings each human being into physical life in an environment appropriate to its own needs. By the laws of physical nature, bodies are engendered in the material world. The soul is allotted to a body according to its merits and flows into the form at the time of quickening. From the time of quickening to the time of birth, the superphysical principles are gradually gaining control of the physical body. At birth, the composite entity is launched into individual existence. Through the periods of growth, the soul releases certain of its powers through the body into objective manifestation. The physical principle is released at birth. The vital principle is released at approximately the 7th year. The emotional principle is released at the 14th year, and the mental principle at the 21st year. The soul, therefore, at the maturity of its physical body, has manifested its subjective bodies through appropriate objective propensities. Life then continues until the pattern is broken up, either by the accident of death or the intention of philosophy. The wise man grows out of bodies during life, but the uninformed man is violently precipitated out of body by the disintegration of the physical form. Can we communicate with the dead, and is it right to do so? Pythagoras of Crotona, one of the greatest of the Greek adepts, taught his disciples that it was possible for the living to communicate with the dead. He warned them, however, against cultivating the art of necromancy because it accomplished no constructive or useful purpose. Spiritualism attracts to its ranks principally the lonely and bereaved. While there can be no reasonable doubt that a certain percentage of psychical phenomena is genuine, those who give themselves to mediumship and other forms of psychism are greatly victimized through their faith and credulity. To turn for advice to the dead is to be unphilosophical. Those who have passed out of this life are no better fitted to advise the living than those still functioning in this world. Nor should the living cling desperately to their friends and relatives who have passed out of this sphere. It may require more of courage to release the dead from our attachments, but to let go is best for all concerned. There are mysteries in the psychical world that few mortals understand, and he who dabbles with the subtle forces of the unseen universe is apt to repent his audacity. The majority of messages that come from behind the veil are vague, platitudinous, and ambiguous, nor is deception unusual. Many lives have been ruined by psychic vagaries. He who listens too often to the whisperings of the spirits may find his angels to be demons in disguise. I know personally many lives that have been hopelessly ruined by dabblings in the mediumistic arts. Humanity understands but imperfectly the mysterious forces dwelling in the borderland between the living and the dead. Until man understands more, he should leave alone these forces which may only lead to madness. The Ouija board, or planchette, called in Europe the devil's flat iron and driven from most of the civilized countries of the world, is a psychic toy that has contributed many tragedies to the sorrows of man's mortal state. Automatic writing, a weird, fascinating pastime, may end in a wide variety of disasters. Addiction to psychic practices sets corrosive forces to work in the mind and soul, and all who seek wisdom in its highest and truest form must avoid the blind alley of psychism. Eliphas Lévy, the great French magician, said that the astral sphere is a beautiful garden of illusions filled with many rare and scented flowers, that around the stem of every flower is coiled a poisonous serpent, and he who would pluck the blossom receives the sting of death. The wise student will acknowledge the reality of psychical phenomena. He will admit communication between the worlds is possible, but he will also maintain that psychic things are not for him. He desires not communication with ghosts, nor to be ruled by disembodied voices, nor to seek for truth in a crystal ball. The true path of wisdom is the building of truth and strength within through study and experience. This simple, positive process needs no assistance from the larvae of the elemental world. Can we remember past lives? To most people, the wisdom of the universe mercifully obscures the past, so that the failings and mistakes of other ages shall not overshadow and hinder the present struggle for accomplishment. Under normal conditions, therefore, it is not possible to remember the details of past incarnations. But the power to rescue this memory from the subconscious mind can be developed with the aid of certain special disciplines known to the adepts of the occult sciences. Usually, however, the remembrance of past lives can accomplish no particular good, and time spent in an effort to stimulate this faculty is love's labor lost. It is far more important to devote thought to the improvement of the present condition than to the vain hope of finding some greatness in the past. There is a certain class of neo-metaphysicians who spend much time discussing their previous incarnations. Strangely enough, most of them believe that in the distant past they were great persons, but in their present lives they have accomplished nothing, and there is not the slightest aura of greatness about them. Such revelations in which someone remembers that he was Hypatia, Cleopatra, or Napoleon are indeed old wives' tales not to be taken seriously, but to be included among the hallucinations of psychical unbalance or just plain fibbing. The best way for the average person to measure what he has been in the past life is to examine the qualities he brings with him into this life. Each person has special abilities, interests and indifferences, likes and dislikes, tastes and aversions. All these characteristics are the records of what has been experienced in the past. Genius is the present evidence of past effort. All that man is today is the sum of what he has been. The debts man pays today, he incurred yesterday. What is called this life is just a small, visible part of the ages, the epilogue to the drama of yesterday. Most people will find that their past life comes to them in their present incarnation chiefly as unfinished business. Also, as each person goes down the years, flashes of the past come to him. He meets someone whom he has known before. He stands in some place where he knows he has stood before. He reads a book about some past civilization and feels that he has lived and labored in that very age the book describes. If you study your face in the mirror, you may discover in your features the shadow of some ancient race. As you go about the daily labors of life, there is about each thing you do some feeling that it has been done before, some sense of large universals overshadowing the small things of the day. The memory of the past is obscured, but the veil is sometimes very thin, and there are moments in the life of every individual when light shines through, and he realizes his kinship with all times and all places. If we do not develop spiritually in this life sufficiently to remember our past lives, do we automatically come into possession of this remembrance when we reach the astral world after death? The transition between the material state and the after-death condition does not bring with it any major improvement in the degree of our knowledge or understanding. The astral body in which we function after the decease of the physical organism is not the depository of the records of past karma. These records are preserved in the ego itself, the transition term death. While it demonstrates to the individual himself the fact of immortality, it does not necessarily bring any broadened viewpoint on the fact of reincarnation and karma. Thus, spirit mediums seldom receive any instruction concerning rebirth from the incarnate entities that speak through them. The memory of past lives comes to the individual only when he has reached a state of development by which the secrets which are locked in the consciousness itself are released into the sphere of objective thinking and knowing. The memory of past lives is locked within the superconscious self. This self is not released by dying merely, but only by the philosophical mystery commonly termed illumination. What part does nationality play in reincarnation? Does a person incarnate into a different nation each time he is reborn? For practical purposes, we may regard nations as parts of races. They are rungs in the ladder of racial evolution. Nations offer specialized environments for the lives evolving within a racial consciousness. The nation into which an individual is born is determined by evolution and karma. The ego is not necessarily reborn each time into a different nation. It often requires many lives to outgrow national environments. National consciousness can hold egos to national programs for several lives. The present tendency towards internationalism is reflected in the short lives of nations, whereas ancient national institutions existed for thousands of years. Few nations today retain their essential characteristics for more than from 300 to 500 years. This itself is an indication of the speeding up of evolution, a tendency consistent throughout nature. As consciousness unfolds, nationalism must give way to internationalism, and evolution itself will finally bring about the condition of men living together in equity and peace. Can we control the length of time between incarnations or determine in advance what the next incarnation shall be? Until an entity reaches a very high degree of spiritual development, it does not have the power to control the intervals between incarnations. These intervals, like all other occurrences, arise from karma. Normally speaking, the only way in which these intervals can be influenced is by intensity of action, particularly mental action. We do not mean a mental effort to influence the time and condition of rebirth, but rather the general intensity of mental awareness. The more highly evolved the intellectual nature, the more profound and philosophic the thought, and the greater the scope of judgment, the longer will be the intervals between lives. This arises from the time required by the ego to assimilate into the soul nature the panorama of mental experience while on earth. Thus, the average individual can transmute the fruits of his mental activity into soul powers in a few hundred years of after-death consciousness. But it is estimated that it will require 10,000 years for Plato to accomplish this. So great was his intellect. Therefore, unless Plato, being a very highly evolved soul, exercises his privilege as an adept to return sooner in the capacity of a teacher, he will normally remain out of incarnation for that length of time. As to the conditions of a future life, these cannot be directly influenced by the average person for the reason that the next incarnation may be devoted to working out the karma of the present life, or it may be dedicated to the transmutation of karma brought forward from earlier incarnations, but not included in the program of the present life. Of course, the whole future depends upon the increasing intelligence and integrity of present action. Do disembodied spirits retain a memory of their earth life experiences? The simple experiments of spiritualism have demonstrated the continuity of consciousness beyond the grave, and all clairvoyants agree that a person who has passed from this state to the subjective plane retains identity and continues as the same individuality as during physical life. A man has 4 bodies, making up what is termed the chain of his personality. The highest of these bodies is chemical organism. After physical death, the individual functions briefly in his etheric double or vital body, which also dies, never surviving for any considerable time the disintegration of the physical organism. Under normal conditions at this stage of our evolution, the average person functions for nearly 1,000 years in the astral body. For this entire period, he retains the individuality of his previous incarnation. The astral body is then dissipated by a phenomenon resembling death, and the consciousness is posited in its mental organism, in which it functions for a period of time consistent with its mental development. With the disintegration of the mental body, usually some 1,200 years after death, the entity loses its personality and becomes again a pure spiritual principle. From this time, the memory of the past life exists only subjectively, and the continuity of consciousness is broken. Therefore, after the disintegration of the mental organism, the personality ends as such. This period is followed immediately by preparations within the ego itself for rebirth, when it causes a new personality to emerge out of its own potential creative power. There are some exceptions to this rule due to special developments. Very highly evolved entities will retain individual consciousness for a much greater time. But we should remember that it is not the personality that really grows. It is the ego or inner self growing through personality and using personality to the accomplishment of its own ends. Thus, John Doe as a personality does not grow through the ages. Rather, the eternal self or the spirit causes a personality temporarily known as John Doe to be emanated out of itself. At the end of approximately 1,200 years, John Doe is entirely reabsorbed into the spiritual cause from which it came. John Doe then absolutely ceases, but the experiences and characteristics of John Doe are incorporated into the consciousness of the permanent ego. Personalities are not reborn, but the principles behind personalities are constantly projecting personal organisms out of themselves, and through these personal organisms contacting the experience spheres of life. Can past karma be escaped by present good deeds? According to the ancient wisdom, that which is done cannot be undone. No philosophical system worthy of the name would fall into the fallacy of vicarious atonement. Nature's bookkeeping system has in it no place for erasures. The motive behind present good deeds should never be to escape past karma, but rather to prevent the making of more evil karma. An individual whose present life is filled with efforts to improve character and increase the measure of meritorious action is establishing a solid philosophical foundation of well-being to be enjoyed in future existences. This explains a mystery which confuses many students. A person will say, "All my life I have done good to others, and all my life I have suffered misfortune. Where is the honesty and integrity of nature?" We bring forward from past existences karma which must be lived out. As we have injured, so we must suffer. Today we are building karma for tomorrow, and if our present life is dedicated to enlightened thinking and living, we are more apt to enjoy the results thereof in a future existence than in this one. However, very often the good deeds of this life have their reward even here. Not only do we bring forward from the past evil karma, but good karma. Consequently, the average life is a complex of fortune and misfortune due to the inconsistencies and ignorance of previous lives. What is the proper philosophical attitude towards suicide? Several newspapers have recently carried accounts of prominent persons who have committed suicide to escape the prolonged inroads of incurable disease. These accounts have raised the question as to the integrity of such action. Is a person justified in ending his own physical life if it appears to be no longer possible for him to live a healthy, normal, and constructive existence? The attitude of society towards suicide has been subjected to numerous changes and modifications in the thousands of years of social history. Some nations have regarded the action of self-destruction as highly honorable. Others have regarded it as commendable under certain extremities, but for the most part, such a course of action has been condemned as irreconcilable with the highest standards of human propriety. The mystery schools of the ancient world were in reasonably complete accord in their condemnation of the deed of suicide. The religio-philosophical institutions taught that self-destruction was an act of violence against the soul. Not that the soul itself could, strictly speaking, be injured, but rather that suicide was a breach of spiritual ethics. Two examples will fairly represent the attitude of the ancients. In the Bacchic and Eleusinian mysteries, the sacred dramas exhibited in tableau and pageantry the death of the universal soul deity Dionysus. This god is torn to pieces by the 12 giants of primordial chaos, who are called the Titans and represent the irrational elements of the material world. After these giants have devoured the body of Dionysus, they are destroyed by the thunderbolt of Zeus, who, from their charred remains, formed as from clay the first human beings. The initiates were instructed in the mystical truth that the human body was composed of a mixture of the elementary substances and divine essences, the former derived from the ashes of the Titans and the latter from the blood of Dionysus or Bacchus. Any man who raised his hand in violence against another or against himself was guilty of impiety against the god Dionysus, whose essences were mixed with every part of the corporeal fabric. Therefore the ancient saying, "Who strikes himself strikes the god within him." Pythagoras held a slightly different view, but the substance of his opinion agreed in effect with the older teachings of the original Orphics. According to the Pythagoreans, the physical body of man was a living temple within the recesses of which dwelt a divine spirit, one with the eternal nature of God. The body was therefore a temple sacred to divinity, and to defile the body was to defame the secret master of the house. This doctrine was so literally enforced that none of the Pythagoreans would permit the body to be mutilated either by surgery or autopsy, and their opinion so completely dominated Greek culture that medical science was limited to the clinical examination of disease. The Platonic philosophy somewhat modified the rigid views of the older schools. Zeus was justified in certain extremities, but the whole subject was circumscribed by profound and exact philosophical rules. For example, an initiate was permitted to take his own life if faced by torture intended to force him to reveal the secrets of the mysteries. He was also permitted to voluntarily sacrifice his life in the service of his God, or in an effort to rescue some unfortunate from extreme danger. He was also permitted this extreme action if it were impossible for him to continue in this life on a level of integrity inconsistent with the inner development of his own soul. He might choose death before spiritual dishonor. In no case, however, was Zeus permitted in order to escape from sickness, sorrow, responsibility, or any material evil which did not afflict the spirit or render the life incapable of further progress. Corruption is the inevitable end of all flesh, but the deterioration of material fabric does not justify physical destruction while life, opportunity, and possibilities of philosophical self-improvement remain. A person who discovers that some disease will permit only a few years or even a few months of life should not think first of self-destruction, but rather of the opportunity that yet remains for him to improve in inward knowledge, so that he may face the transition with a good hope. Death is an initiation into the spiritual mysteries of the inner life, and each man should approach the inevitable end fortified with wisdom and vision. Man begins to die the day that he is born, and as the poet wrote, the cradle is ever rocking in the open grave. Therefore, all that man accomplishes in this material sphere he accomplishes while dying. An uninformed man once asked an aged initiate why he did not take life less strenuously in his declining years. The old sage replied, "Life is a race with time, and as my course is nearly run, should I cease striving, or, like the runner at the games, try harder because the goal is nearer?" The person contemplating Zeus would do well to remember the story told of the Greek philosopher who lay dying in the house of a disciple. The friends were gathered in an outer room when a stranger entered with some gossip of the day. Chancing to look through the doorway into the inner apartment where the philosopher lay dying, they beheld him propped up on one elbow, listening attentively to the gossip. One called out to him, "Father, why do you listen to the gossip of this world when you are so soon to leave it?" "I may be dying," the wise man replied, "but I am not yet dead, and while I still live, I can still learn." A wise person does not wreak vengeance upon himself for the evils of his world. He realizes that the purpose of life is the accomplishment of wisdom and experience. Each of the vicissitudes of life brings with it the opportunity to increase knowledge and perfect self. While yet the breath of life is within any body, experience is possible to the soul within that body. Philosophy demands of its disciples that they learn all things well and seek to avoid none of the experiences of this life. The ancient teachings set forth in symbolic terms the punishments and penalties of Zeus. As the great Neoplatonist expressed it, in normal death the soul separates itself from the body by a natural process. In Zeus, the body separates itself from the soul by a violent and irrational action. As this action is contrary to the psychical laws of nature, vibrations are set up which temporarily disrupt the harmony of the soul. For this reason, it is written that the Zeus is neither dead nor alive. He has violently destroyed his physical vehicle, but he has not fulfilled the years of his destiny. Therefore, he must remain in the superphysical elements of the earth to which his superphysical parts are still attached, until the normal span of his life, as set forth in the spiritual archetype of his physical existence, has been completed. To such disembodied but not decarnated entities, the ancients gave the name of the undead. They must continue physical but unseen until the law of their life has been satisfied. While this circumstance works no permanent hardship upon the soul, which in its natural time is released from this artificial condition, it works a temporary hardship, and the suicide discovers that his action has delivered him from no evil, released him from no problem, and preserved him from no disaster. Does the doctrine of reincarnation conflict with the teachings of Christianity? On at least two occasions, Jesus acknowledged pre-existence, which is almost equivalent to an actual acknowledgement of reincarnation. He certainly refers to his messianic pre-existence in these words: "Before Abraham was, I am." In another place, Jesus declares definitely that his disciples were with him before the beginning of the world. According to the Gospels, these disciples were ordinary men, and there is no inference that they should be considered as divine incarnations or in any way exceptional from other men. To have been with Jesus before the worlds infers a vast spiritual existence and a continuity of consciousness over a great extent of time. Jesus also inferred that he himself will return to this world, and this second coming, towards which so many pious Christians look, would itself establish reincarnation beyond debate. The Master further promised that those who believe in his words shall do greater things even than he has done. That St. John accepted the doctrine of rebirth is evident from the 12th verse of the 3rd chapter of Revelation. Him that overcometh will I make a pillar in the temple of my God, and he shall go no more out. The words "go no more out" are susceptible of no other interpretation than as a reference to periodic returns to an earthly existence for those who have not yet perfected themselves in the mysteries of life. To sum up the biblical situation, there is no definite statement concerning reincarnation in the Bible other than the verse from Revelation just quoted. There are, however, a number of enigmatical statements in which the law of reincarnation seems to be inferred. Without this doctrine, many of the passages of the Old and New Testaments are meaningless and without point. On the other hand, nowhere in the Jewish or Christian scriptures is the doctrine of rebirth assailed, denied, criticized, or condemned. The whole subject, therefore, is not a doctrinal issue, and the belief in reincarnation cannot be dismissed as heretical from the words of Jesus or the prophets. The prevalence of the belief in reincarnation in the first centuries of the Christian era is evidenced by its wide acceptance by the early Greek and Latin fathers of the Christian Church. It appears also that the Essenes, a religious order of which Jesus is supposed to have been a member, accepted the doctrine of rebirth, having derived knowledge of it from Pythagoras, the founder of their order. The Gnostics, the most learned of Christian orders and the first heretics, taught reincarnation and claimed to have derived their mystical traditions from a disciple of St. Matthew. Reincarnation was defended by many fathers of the early church, among them Origen, Justin Martyr, Clemens Alexandrinus, Nemesius, Synesius, Hilarius, and Arnobius. Probably the most outspoken of these Christian patriarchs was Origen, a man who combined a high degree of philosophical insight and true Christian piety. He writes of reincarnation in this fashion: "Is it not more in conformity with reason that every soul, for certain mysterious reasons, I speak now according to the opinions of Pythagoras, Plato, and Empedocles, whom Celsus frequently names, is introduced into a body and introduced according to its deserts and former actions? It is generally believed that in the 6th century AD, the Fifth Council of Constantinople anathematized reincarnation, but it is now evident that this prevailing prejudice is unfounded." To quote the Reverend A. Henderson, Vicar of St. John de Sepulchre, Norwich, "A further objection which exists in the minds of many is based on the supposed condemnation of the doctrine by the Church in the Fifth General Council of Constantinople. A careful consideration of the historical situation makes it abundantly clear that the question of reincarnation was not even raised at the council, and that the condemnation of certain extreme tenets of the Origenists was the act of Menas, Patriarch of Constantinople, in the provincial synod. In this he was instigated by the Emperor Justinian, who ordered him to procure the subscription of the bishops to the anathemas. This local synod was held in AD 543, while the General Council did not meet until 10 years later. It is easy to understand, however, how this extra-conciliar sentence of Menas was, at a later period, mistaken for a decree of the General Council. The above quotation clarifies 2 points of controversy. First, the problem of reincarnation was not even considered by the Fifth General Council. Second, the Provincial Synod, directed against the Origenists, makes no specific reference to reincarnation, and there is no way of proving that the doctrine of rebirth was even one of the extreme tenets which had irritated Justinian. It therefore follows, as Mr. G.R.S. Mead, an eminent scholar in matters of early Christian tradition, has observed, that the Christian Church has never formally anathematized reincarnation. E.D. Walker, in his valuable work, Reincarnation, includes the illustrious name of Saint Buenaventura among the many churchmen who favored the doctrine. Professor Wincenti Lutoslawski, in his important book Pre-Existence and Reincarnation, writes thus of rebirth: It finds favor even with Roman Catholic theologians, amongst whom was the great scholar Monsignor Archbishop Passavali, 1820 to 897, who not only declared that reincarnation is not in conflict with Catholic dogma, but himself accepted the doctrine at the age of 62 from two disciples of the Polish school of philosophy, and lived up to the age of 72, unshaken in his conviction that he had lived many times on earth and that he was likely to return. The attitude of the Christian Church in the 20th century on the vital issue of reincarnation is best summarized in the opinions of two leading churchmen. Cardinal Mercier, the heroic prelate of the Belgians, representing the opinions of the Roman Catholic faith, while not committing himself to a personal belief in reincarnation, has definitely stated that the doctrine is not in conflict with Catholic dogma. For Protestant Christianity, Dean Inge, late of St. Paul's, London, assumes a similar attitude, finding no conflict between this, the oldest creed, and modern Episcopalianism. From the preceding, there is reasonable assurance that the modern Christian can incorporate the doctrine of reincarnation as a part of his religious belief and remain safe within the odor of sanctity. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.